when working in this program, it ends up being a series of files when we build a little application or something together. It's not just one file. Like when you're working in Photoshop, you're pretty much working in a PSD file, right? And then sometimes, when you're ready to export something out of that PSD file, you might make a JPEG or a PNG, or you might cut up a couple different images out of it. We've ultimately got this one PSD file that is your editable file, and then you publish out of it for something you're actually going to use. It's similar with Animate, where we've got this .fla file that we save, which stands for Flash because it's old. And then we're able to publish out of that, and it automatically creates a bunch of different types of files, and I'll show you that as we move on. But one of the most important things just to start with, I've got my Finder open here, and I've just got an empty desktop, is when we start working inside of this program, it's really important to create a folder to work inside of with your project. Don't just have FLA files willy-nilly all over the place, because as you start publishing, other files are going to go along with it that all need to stay together. So when I'm using this, I always just start with creating a new folder somewhere. So I want you all to do this wherever is your good working directory on your computer. Just create a new folder, and we'll have probably a half dozen of these little demos, just getting introduced to the program here. I'm going to name this one Symbols. That's where we're going to start out. But more importantly, I just have this folder that we're going to start with. All right, so I have a folder named Symbols, and then back inside of Animate, you should see this kind of start new file. You might see a little pop-up box that tells you different things, different options you can start with. Ultimately, we want to start with just creating a new file. So you can click Create New on Animate. And then we'll open this little new document dialog box. Talk about them real briefly, but we're always going to use the same type. We're always going to use this HTML5 Canvas type. Let me explain what they are. So first of all, this ActionScript 3.0, this is the type of file that was used for like 15 years when it was called Flash. And this is a programming language called ActionScript that's very close to JavaScript. I'm sure you have all probably heard of JavaScript. That's the main one of the main three programming languages on the web: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll learn a little bit, I'll teach you a little bit about HTML and CSS in this class, but for the most part, we'll just be using JavaScript. But this ActionScript 3.0 is kind of legacy, it's kind of outdated, unless we were doing something that was just for animation, that we were gonna export to like a video file or something like that, and not actually put on the web with interactivity. We wouldn't really use this because it has outdated plugin technology to view it, and the browsers don't really like that anymore. These Air, where it says Air for desktop, Air for iOS, Air for Android, that's the types that you would do if you were, it's one way to actually create an app. When I use the word app, that's a little bit of a loose definition, because there are apps that are in the app stores on both Android and iOS. And then there's also what's called a web app, which basically I've been making apps since before they were called apps. When I first started making applications in the late 90s, they were on little CD-ROMs and little business card size CDs. And, I've gone through this whole, I made a bunch of web apps way back then, and then with the big mobile revolution, made a bunch of actual app store apps, and that's what these are. But now it's more and more common to use the actual web app approach and use HTML5, and then use that to turn it into apps in some kind of other way. So what we will be doing in this class is building an actual web app. Putting things on the stores to download is just it could be a whole class in itself of just publishing that. It's pretty complicated, but it can be done through this program. But either way, what you're learning will kind of lead you towards that. But I'll talk to you guys a bit throughout how we would go through the process of once I show you how to publish online and put things just on the internet, which you can see on iOS devices and Android devices just through a browser, I'll share a little bit at some point about how you would take it to that next step if you want to make an app to put it in the store. We'll come back to the HTML5 Canvas. That's the one we're going to use. But I want to point out that these ActionScript 3 and then these different Air ones are a little bit outdated. There's still certain reasons that you would use them, but for the most part, we just want to stick with HTML5. These other ones under beta platforms, VR360, whoa, there we go. WebGL, VR Panorama. These were introduced about a year or two ago. They're very, very simplified versions of ways to make little VR apps inside of this program. It's going to be, we're not really going to deal with that much. They're really limited and just do some real basics to get you started, and then you'd have to know quite a bit of programming to kind of take those much further. As we go down, some newer stuff. I'm not sure what this custom platforms is. Got some different script files. All right, I'm not gonna worry about that. So we're gonna start with an HTML5 Canvas element. Now, what that means, I already explained what HTML5 means, which is just kind of a catch-all word for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all three programming languages that get cooked together in the same bowl to make what you see out of the browser. Every single website that you've ever seen will probably have all three of those programming languages all working together. Now, the word canvas is a particular HTML element. HTML is used to basically define what elements are on the screen. This is an image. This is some text. This is a video. CSS stands for cascading style sheets. That's usually used for positioning things on the screen and kind of setting rules for how things look. And then JavaScript is used to actually make things work. Make buttons work, make things, do all kinds of stuff. Now, learning all three of these languages, and even though it's free to do, creating things from scratch, using them, is quite a learning curve, and you have to do quite a bit of programming. The beauty of using Adobe Animate here, even though it's kind of hidden as an animation program, is that we're able to kind of skip using 2 out of 3 of those programming languages. We're able to skip using HTML, and we're able to skip using CSS, at least as far as having to manually code anything. And we're able to use this program instead to create objects like text and images and animations. And then also, once we create those objects, lay them out on the screen using layers and a timeline and keyframes and all these visual tools that ultimately ends up publishing and making different files like HTML and JavaScript files that will work in the browser, but we're able to use this graphical interface to kind of write some of that code for us. So out of the 3 web programming languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we're only going to have to write a little bit of JavaScript in this class to make a bunch of awesome stuff work on the web. The HTML and the CSS is kind of taken care of for us. Now, this word canvas is one particular HTML element. HTML elements are like little tags, if you've ever seen it. In fact, here, let me open up a browser. Bing search engine. We'll go to bing.com. And you can do this on any website, doesn't matter where you are. Inside of Chrome, you can also do it inside of Safari, inside of Firefox, usually in IE. Safari, you might have to turn on some developer tools or something, but in any browser, you can right-click anywhere and choose Inspect, and you'll get this little window that pops up. Now, the first time you do it, you may see it pop up on one of the sides over here. But if you do, I usually press this little 3 dots and make it show up on the bottom. But what this does is this shows you all of the code underlying in this page. So I can see on the left here, this is all HTML. These are all these different tags defining what the different elements are. And then over here on the right is all the CSS that's laying it all together. What I'm pointing out is there's a ton of different little HTML tags like this that build up a page. And let's see, well, won't get too deep into it, but they define things like this is text, this is an image, blah, blah, blah. And traditionally, you would have a ton of these little tags to kind of define what's on the page. But with Animate, what we can do is we use just a single tag, a single HTML tag called a canvas tag, that instead of having to build a whole bunch of tags to put stuff on the screen, we can add text and imagery and interactivity and everything we need to do just to this single canvas tag and display it on the screen. It becomes very, very powerful. And if you've ever tried, or in the future, if you ever try to build something, you know, on the web just by programming it from scratch with like a text editor, you'll realize you know, how much you can do with what I'm going to teach you in this class without having to know a lot of programming, which is very, very cool. So it's a little background, a little setup here of what we're gonna have. So when we create a new project or a new file in this program, we always, in this class, are always going to choose HTML5 Canvas. All right. Now the second part of that is over here in the details. I want you all to set up a new document like this. So open Animate, create new, make sure HTML5 Canvas is chosen, and then we're going to choose a specific width and height. In this class, it is too much complication to add to this class to do any kind of like dynamic responsive views, where a lot of times if I build an application, I've got to have it like programmatically change size based on different, whether you're portrait or your landscape, or you're on a mobile device versus a desktop. There's a lot can go into an application, could even have multiple different interfaces based on different screen sizes. I'll show you a little bit about that later on. But for right now, for all of our projects, our examples that we're going to work through together, and then your idea that you're going to work out, we're going to always keep this same size, 960 wide by 540 high. And that just came about from a research project, what was kind of a nice happy medium size that looks good on desktops, looks good on laptops, and will still fit properly, at least landscape, on most mobile devices. So set up your project to be 960 by 540. And then there's the frame rate. The frame rate, I believe, is 24 by default. You want to set that to 30. This has to do with the animation and how many frames per second that the program uses. And 24 is the default pretty much everywhere but North America. 24 is the default in Europe, I believe in Asia, and it's the default for feature films, but anything in North America that is on a screen, that's not a movie screen, TV, any kind of internet animation, 30 frames per second is the standard that we use. So once you have it set to HTML5 Canvas and 960 by 540 and 30 frames a second, go ahead and hit create. And that will open up Animate for us and have a big empty thing. Now you will probably see a white stage like this when you first start out. I believe that's the default. I just personally like to set my stage black to start out. Really doesn't matter. It's just something that I do. But let's go ahead and save this file now. Once we have it open, before I start kind of showing you around the interface and what all these crazy buttons mean and stuff, let's just go to File, Save. And I want you to choose that folder that you created and save the file inside of it. So I have a folder named Symbols with a capital S. And inside of it, you see it's trying to save a .fla file. Again, that stands for the legacy name of this program, which was Flash. And that's just the name of the editable file that we'll be opening in this program. What I usually do, you can name things how you like, but as we move on, just having some kind of naming convention is helpful. Just making sure you're consistent. It helps across all aspects of creating things on computers. But what I like to do is I make the folder name have an uppercase, and then the file name, I'll name the same thing, but with lowercase. So I'm just going to name this symbols.fla. I'm going to save it inside of my symbols.fla folder. Poof. And that's just a good starting point that no matter what you're working on, when you build a new project, it really goes for anything, but specifically in Animate, as you'll see shortly when we actually publish things to the browser, it'll automatically create folders and files and things for you. But we want to make sure that we have a folder that's encapsulating that, puts it all together. All right, so we have that set up, we have a file set up. The first thing I want to point out is the workspaces, okay? So if you go to Window in the drop down, and down towards the bottom, there's this workspaces flyout, and depending on what you're looking at, most software programs these days, especially Adobe programs, you may have dealt with this in other programs, have all these predefined layouts, right? So I could look at a designer layout and it's going to change things around. Or I could look at a developer layout and that'll change things around and open different windows and dock things in different places. I can also start to just grab things and move them around and dock things however I want and move the interface around. Sometimes that can be useful when you're a power user and you really understand what you're doing and what you're trying to use, but sometimes it can be a bit chaotic in terms of, well, my screen doesn't look like your screen, or I lost that window. So what I like to do at the beginning is have everyone using the same layout. Go to Window, Workspaces, Essentials. And that's probably what you guys are sitting on right now. If it's by default, maybe you've used something else, but just go to Window, Workspace, Essentials, and that'll set it up. So you should pretty much see this layout. I'm taking my timeline down here and dragging it up a little. In fact, I am going to set my stage to white just so that you can see it a little bit better right now. And you should generally see this. We've got the actual stage is what it's called. This is the 960 by 540 area that we set. You can also see the 30 frames per second over here. So this stage area is where we're going to put everything that's going to be on the screen. All the tools around it are tools that we'll use to help work with that. You can see your regular kind of drawing tools down to the left. We'll take a look at each of these shortly. Down here, we've got our timeline. This is where, for now at least, this is where we can create layers and set up different layers. That should be familiar to you. The timeline is where we'll deal with animation. We'll get to that probably next week. But we set up layers, animation, we've got our drawing tools, and then over here, we've got our properties, which is what, and then a library. Okay, I've got this assets panel up here, which I'm not sure if that is there by default or I just have that open. But over here, our properties panel and our library will become really important. Our properties panel is what's called context sensitive, meaning depending on what we have selected, either something we've drawn on the stage or some kind of tool, whatever we have selected is what it's going to show us the options to kind of tinker with over here in the properties panel. In fact, you can see, I think this is new in Animate 2020, that we actually have these tabs across the top where it shows document and then frame, object, and tool. These are kind of grayed out for now until I actually start to select things, and then we'll be able to choose between them. But for right now, just leaving it on document is good. But this is where we see the properties for our document. This is what we set initially, again, the width and height, and then the frames per second. One thing I want you to do right now is click on this More Settings underneath this Document Settings dropdown. And what we can do is inside of this document settings, more settings flyout, which just gives us some other stuff. But we want to, let's see, we want to use advanced layers. Does that come by default? We're not going to worry about that for now. What I want you to do is once you make sure that you have your width set to 960, your height set to 540, and your frame rate set to 30, just click on Make Default right here. I want you to click on Make Default and hit OK. Then the next time that we create a new file together, you won't have to put in and remember 960 by 540 or 30 frames per second. Once we click Make Default, it will just use those when we create a new HTML5 Canvas document every time as a default. So that saves us having to remember that. All right, so over here, all these little icons. So again, I explained the stage. There's kind of this timeline down here with some layers. There's your regular drawing tools we'll go through in a minute. Over here is your properties panel. Over to the right, these are other windows and other panels that you can click on and see, like you can get your colors, different color swatches, transform swatch, align. We'll use some of these we won't use. But there are a lot, who is this one? Oh, a frame picker. Interesting, that's new. There are a lot of different windows and panels that we can use that are not necessarily showing. And even though they have a bunch of little icons over here, if I'm ever trying to use a panel that you can't find or don't know where it is, or you lost something, you can always go up to the window drop-down box, the same place where we went to the workspaces. Every single panel that you would be able to get, you can get to through here. So for example, if I had my library and I accidentally dragged it and accidentally deleted it, and oh crap, my library is gone, I don't know how to get it back. I can always go to Window, Library, and poof, it's back. And then I can kind of drag it back into its space here. So once again, under Window, Workspaces, Essentials, you can always, if you screw up your Essentials workspace and accidentally drag things all over the place, you can always go to Windows, Workspaces, and then Reset, and it'll reset whatever current one you're on. So if we want to reset Essentials, you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Then it kicks it back to the default size. So I just want to make sure everyone's looking at this Essentials view so that we're all looking at the same thing in the same places. Let's see. All right, so take a look at the interface. We have our file saved. Let's go ahead and draw a couple things. Now, let's see, rather than starting at the top, let's just draw a circle. Let's go down here to the oval tool. Notice that as you roll over, it'll give you a tool tip telling you what all these tools are. I'll pick through them all here in a moment, but let's just draw something first. So if you select this oval tool over on the left, all right, as soon as I select it, notice the properties panel changed. It went from doc over here, which is showing me the document properties, over to tool, because I have a tool selected, and it automatically knew that, okay, now I want to see the properties of this tool. Now I could just draw by default, poof, I just drew an oval. But I can very much, here, this top one is the selection tool. So once I drew the oval, instead of just drawing more ovals, if I want to select and delete things, I can choose this top selection tool, and then I can select things that I drew on the screen, and I can delete them. Now, I can set properties of my oval or my circle from the tools panel before I draw it. So two of the most common, we've got the fill and the stroke. So the fill is the color on the inside of the shape, and then the stroke would be the color on the outside of the shape. So I just changed the fill and stroke, and now I can draw it, and you can't really see that stroke because it's so thin, but I could make the stroke size much larger. So maybe if I make the stroke size 20 pixels, and now I draw there, now you can see that there is indeed this shape oval circle that I drew that has the fill color and the stroke color, similar to the way Illustrator works. We are drawing vector graphics when we draw stuff inside of Animate here. Raster graphics are like photos, and they are defined by individual pixels. And then vector graphics are more kind of flat art looking, and those are defined by math equations, and they have no real resolutions. You could zoom way in on them. Show you some of these tools, but if I were to zoom way in, no matter how big I get, it's never going to pixelate. If I zoom in on an image or a raster, it's going to pixelate. So we're drawing vectors in here. Now, I won't go through all of the settings because most of them are pretty self-explanatory. But when I'm on the oval tool, for the oval tool or the rectangle tool, you know, just clicking freehand will draw ovals or rectangles, but if you hold shift, that's going to force it to stay either a perfect circle. Oops, holding shift. Yeah, there we go. Undo a couple of these. Or with the rectangle tool, you either draw rectangles, or if you hold shift, it will force it to be a perfect square. All right, so that's also pretty common with any kind of drawing programs and how that works. Now, these tool options over here, the fill in the stroke size, you can change the style of the stroke line. Let's see, we're not going to mess with the scaling. You can actually play with different like caps on corners if you're doing a rectangle. Oh, actually I have the rectangle selected. So with the oval tool, there's a few different options down here. Depending on the size of your laptop screen, you may have to like scroll or maybe collapse some of these things to see them. So under color and style, you've got all that stuff we just kind of talked about. And then oval options, we can play with angles. So maybe a start angle of 45 degrees. If I were to draw that, then all of a sudden it makes this weird Pac-Man shape. Or an inner radius. Maybe I take the start angle back down, but I give it an inner radius. Now I go to draw, and now it's got like a donut, a shape within a shape. So each of these shapes do have a whole bunch of different options you can play with. But what's cool is not only can you play with them before the fact, but some of them at least, I think not all of them, but some of them you can actually select and change them in real time. So right now I drew my circle here, and if I were to just try and change this fill color, okay, it doesn't change because I don't have it selected. So let me explain how selection works here a little bit now that we've drawn a shape on the screen. This very top tool, the selection tool, we can click to select something, and before we make symbols out of it, which we'll talk about after our first break, we'll take a break in about 5 minutes here. You can kind of see the pixels when you select something. And let's see, if I select both of these, then, okay, then my properties panel goes to object. All right, so when I have nothing selected, this is the context sensitive nature I was talking about with the properties panel over here. So when I have nothing selected, it shows me the document properties. When I have a tool selected that I want to draw something, it'll show me the properties for that specific tool that I can use before I draw it. Now, if I actually have an object selected, I can click and region select the entire thing, or I can just click on it, but notice that the fill is selected separately from the stroke. If I region select both of them, you can see that it goes to object. And rather than doc showing me the document properties, tool gets grayed out because I don't have the tool selected anymore. But when I have something selected on the stage, it will show me the actual object properties. And here is where, in real time, I could actually change the fill color and see it change the stroke color and see it change. Again, because they're selected, all right? I can select this again. I can play with the stroke size interactively. I could even play with like making those dotted lines, all kinds of funky things. I can play with the scale. There's a lot of options here, smooth versus a straightened shape. Lots of options depending on what type of shape you're creating. But before I go through some of the other tools over here, I just kind of want to point out the context sensitive nature of this panel over here, that it really depends on what you have selected, what it's going to show you how to do over this. So I'm going to take the next 5 minutes and just very quickly go through what all of these drawing tools are, because most of them are pretty self-explanatory. The ones that aren't, we probably won't use in this class this much. Another thing that I'll talk a lot about besides just showing you what to click on in here is hotkeys. Hotkeys are just keyboard shortcuts to do certain things. Having spent so much time in this program, I can't even begin to tell you. Sitting in a cubicle in an agency for 8 hours a day for months at a time, building something, using hotkeys can save so much time when you're spending a lot of time doing something. If you ever find yourself clicking in 3 different things, like having to right click and then finding a command somewhere, or using the top drop down menu to kind of find a command. Certain commands that you use a lot will have hotkeys, and I will be talking about the hotkeys and teaching you those hotkeys in this class. Even though you don't necessarily have to use them, you can just click on the interface. But there's a lot of instances where hotkeys are much, much faster. So the very first one is undo. Undo, you can technically, I could right click anywhere. Actually, I can't right click and undo. That's interesting. But under edit, there's a undo and a repeat. But you can see that next to, under the edit drop down, next to them, there's these little, on the Mac, it shows the little command thing, Command Z or Command Y. If you're on a PC, that'll have a little control thing right there. That's basically showing you that, yeah, I could click this to undo, and I could keep going edit, undo, or I can just use Command Z. And that will keep undoing down to like 100 different levels of what I've done. And that is definitely your friend in this program, undo. If you ever want to undo something that you accidentally did, just hit Command Z, will undo something, and then Command Y, I think it's Command Y, will redo it. All right, so anyway, just undid a little bit there. But let me very quickly go down the line here. Now, some of these tools have a little arrow in the lower right. You guys see that? The lower right of the icon is a little arrow. That is a flyout. And what that means is you can click and hold on that, and it will fly out to show you another related tool. All right, so the flyout of the selection tool is actually a sub-selection tool. So the selection tool will just grab an entire shape as it is. And then the sub-selection tool, if I choose that one and then click on an element, instead of grabbing the entire shape, it's going to show me, you can see it actually on the stroke here, it's going to show me the actual little vector points that make up the shape. So I selected this, and I can see when I select on the stroke, I can see these points, and then I can click on the actual point, and I could drag it and move it and distort the shape. And as soon as I select the point, then all of a sudden I get these Bezier curve handles. You know, once you select a point, you can then adjust these handles, drag them out, and just change the curvature and the shape of things very quickly. So there are a lot of vector drawing tools inside of Animate like this, but I want to point out A, this flyout, and B, the difference between the regular selection tool that just grabs the whole shape versus the sub-selection tool, which will try and grab, here, let me separate these. If I grab the regular selection tool, I'm gonna grab the middle and just drag it out of the stroke here. So I got these two separate elements. Let me try the sub-selection tool on this little blob. Yeah, okay, there we go. So I hit the outside of it, and I can see all the individual points that are making up the shape. At any point, I can select one of them and then edit it, drag it around. So sub-selection versus regular selection gives you the power to get inside of these shapes. It's gonna undo back to where I have a nice little circle here. The next one down is the free transform tool. So what this does is this will also select as you click. So I'll select something and it'll put this box around it with all of these little handles, all right? And this allows you to move, rotate, and scale all from one spot. So be aware that when I just click and select, it's only clicking the inside of the shape. I would have to like shift select the outside to get both of them together. That's just kind of the way it works by default, that whenever you click on will select and the inside of a shape is separate from the stroke that was created. So you can use shift to select multiple things, or you can always just region select. And this free transform tool will allow me to just click and move anything, which is basically the same as using the selection tool will allow you to do the same thing without those handles. But with the free transform tool, besides just moving, I can also click on any of these corners, and I can scale my object around either by killing the aspect ratio, or if I hold shift, it will force the aspect ratio to stay the same as I scale. And I can do that on any corner, scale it, whatever. And you'll see the icon change from this little crosshairs that let you move things to, if I go to a corner, it gives you this little arrow, which is letting you know you're going to scale something. Or if I drag just outside one of the outer corners, it'll change to a little rotation icon, and that's where I can use to actually rotate something. Let me draw a square, which is sitting with these weird dotted things. Here, let me set this back to normal, set my stroke size to like 10, draw a square, and now I'll use the free transform tool to region select around the whole thing, and now I can rotate the square around. So holding shift while you're rotating will actually step to 45 degrees. If you're trying to rotate something exactly, you can hold shift. Just like holding shift while you're scaling will keep it uniform, at least if you do it from the corner. So real basic stuff, just drawing shapes, moving them, rotating them, scaling them, and being able to select them either by the entire selection tool or the sub-selection tool. So, all right, free transform tool. Next down, we have a polygon tool, which lets you just click points and draw shapes that way. You double click to close it. You can look more in the polygon tool. There's a fly out of the polygon tool, the lasso tool, which is just another selection technique. It's a way to just draw a funky shape and select just that shape. Notice also that as we create basic shapes in Animate, that you can indeed just take a portion of it and select part of it and separate it from the rest. You can draw complicated shapes and things like that. If we draw shapes on top of each other and then go to select them, they'll actually like become part of the same shape. So now I can't really move this without getting rid of what's in the, what's in the other one too. So these shapes, as you put them on top of each other, will kind of combine, which sometimes is really useful if you're trying to draw something. Sometimes you don't want that at all, and you'll end up just putting shapes on different layers to keep that from happening. So this lasso tool is just another selection tool. The asset warp tool, we don't really need to get into this. That lets you kind of select things that are like images and warp them around. We don't need to worry about that too much. You've got some different brush tools. You've got a fluid brush tool, classic brush tool, and a pencil tool. All of these, for the most part, you can click on the tool part of the properties panel. And as you click these, you can just see, why it keeps going to object. Oh, probably because I have a selection. If I unselect by just clicking in the ether, and now I select this tool. Okay, so now it's showing me as I click down the tools, fluid brush versus classic brush versus pencil tool. The brushes, I believe, both paint a fill, whereas the pencil tool will draw a stroke, will draw a line. They each have different options here. The fluid brush, I believe the biggest difference is if you're using a stylus pen, you can keep track of all of the smoothing and roundness and angles that your pen is using. You can get pretty detailed with how you're drawing inside of here. But ultimately, just drawing little colors and shapes. Classic brush, similar, we can change the brush size and different things, set different smoothing, change the color, but we're ultimately just drawing little squiggles of fill here. You could select with a regular tool, or even select with a sub-selection tool and see all the individual points that make up these complicated shapes that you just drew very quickly. The pencil tool, similar, but it will draw actual strokes rather than fill. It's a little thick right now. That's a difference there. And then we've gone through the rectangle tool and the oval tool. Both of these have flyouts as well. There's a rectangle primitive tool and an oval primitive tool. I'll talk a little bit about the difference in those when we get into creating symbols, But for right now, we don't ever need to use those in this class. In fact, I think they're kind of silly. Just leave it as the default rectangular primitive. We have this polystar tool that allows you to draw polygons, but in completely interesting ways that we can go down here in the tool options and I can change the number of sides. Maybe I want a 12-sided polygon, a dodecahedron, or we can change it from a polygon to a star, and I can start to create stars of different numbers of sides as well. So just besides regular circles and rectangles, we can draw these different types of polygons as well. The next one down, a line tool, guess what that does? Draws a line. Text tool, guess what that does? Make some text. So when you select the text tool and look at the tools panel, you've got all these different tools for fonts. We'll talk a little bit about fonts later on, but for right now, it's easy enough. Most of it's self-explanatory as far as what font you're using, what's your paragraph style, all this. I can click, hello, and make some text. So we can draw, we can make text. We can actually import images into this as well. So we can create any shapes, any graphics we want. We can import things from other programs that we'll go through in another class. We've got an eraser tool. Guess what that does? Erases things. And we've got a paint bucket tool and an ink bottle tool that both fill up stuff. So if I were to have the paint bucket tool, I've got this fill color. You can click in here. It's going to fill things up. Our eyedropper tool will just grab a color for us. We'll grab this black color, grabs the color. This camera tool, we're not going to use in this class. If you select it, it automatically adds some funky camera layer down here. And it's basically a way, if you're making some animation, to move the camera around on the screen. It's really good for animating, but we're going to be making some interactive pieces. And it doesn't really work well for that. It kind of gets in the way. So we're not really going to use the camera tool. Hand tool just lets you pan around on this. Now, you may accidentally, if you're using a touchpad or something, you may accidentally tilt your screen. In fact, I'm using a Mac right now, and I've got the regular touchpad, and I can use 2 fingers to rotate the canvas, which can be really helpful if you're actually drawing. You can do it by accident sometimes. And the first time I did it, it took me a long time to find this little icon up here. There's a rotation tool icon that lets you kind of rotate, you know, manually with your mouse rather than using the 2-finger drag. But if you ever accidentally do it or get it off kilter, this center stage icon, you just click that and poof, it comes back to normal. All right, and then finally we've got a zoom tool. Guess what that does? Zooms in and out. You can hold Alt or Option, zoom back. You can also use this drop down up here for zooming. I'm going to put it back to 100, but you can fit it in your window, show all these different zoom options. Then we've got this little 3 dots to edit the toolbar. I can click that, and you can actually add other tools and things to the toolbar that aren't there. Which is kind of interesting. I believe this is new in 2020. There's some bones tools for animating. Most notably that's not in there is these different pen tools that if you're used to drawing in Illustrator, that you can use these pen tools to create different points, different sub-selection points. You can also change it from being the Bezier curve from being a corner to being a curve. So you can add, you can actually drag these tools onto the bar if you wanted. So poof, I just dragged the pen tool onto it. So it looks like, I believe that's new in 2020. It used to be a long scrolling thing that you would have to kind of scroll to see, but I kind of like what they did. They limited it to the basics, and some of these more advanced tools, you can just kind of drag onto the toolbar if you want to use them, or you don't even have to put them on the toolbar. You can just select them from here. Oh no, it looks like you can't. So yeah, you do have to drag them to the toolbar if you want to use them. So if you're used to doing a lot of Bezier curve drawing and shape drawing in Illustrator, you could use these different pen tools. In fact, you could drag them to the same spot and give them flyouts like this. So if I wanted all 4 pen tools, all of a sudden I've got a flyout here with all 4 pen tools. I'm going to add this gradient tool down here. So it's really easy to kind of add these things or remove them. All right, I'm going to leave the pen. Well, actually, I'll just remove it all. Whoops. I'm going to grab the bottom of that. That's what happens. All right, so very easy to kind of customize your interface. But once again, if you get lost, you can always go to Window, Workspace, Reset Essentials. That'll set things back to the way it goes. So that's the basics of how to just draw stuff on the stage. So once again, basic different selecting things, different shape building things, different color things, our document settings, and then you'll see the different tool settings as you select the tools. And then as you select things on stage, my selection tool, then you'll be able to see the actual object properties for each of these things you select on the stage. So pretty basic, but that's how we can just draw some shapes and get started with the stuff. I'm not going to save my file yet. We're going to come back to that because we're going to draw some things and make some symbols out of them.